Hello, everyone. It's Vivian and Asimos from the podcast you are just about to listen to. And I just wanted to give you a heads up that very soon, in about a month, we're going to have a really big announcement here on the channel. So if you want to be able to stay in the know, please do subscribe to us. Wherever it is that you listen to podcasts, you can follow us on social media so you do not miss the announcement. Oh, and obviously, go buy Holly's book, Fans and Fandom, A Journey into the Passion and Power of Fan Culture. And also, you can go pre-order my book, Cosplay and the Dressing of Identity. Anyway, bye!
Hello and welcome to I'm a Fan of That, the podcast for all your nerdy love things. I don't know what that was. Through the objects that we adore. My name is Holly Swinyard. I am a pop culture writer, games writer person, I guess. And I'm here with...
I'm Vivian and Asimos, and I'm a pop anthropologist, which basically just means I'm an anthropologist without a uni.
We're adults with proper grown-up jobs. This is a fun episode. This is a me episode, which means we're going to have a big history jump at some point. Yay!
Yay!
And it does also mean that I've brought a object which is not currently with me where I'm recording, but I do have it and I will have a picture of. And that object is Frankenstein. Not the doctor, not the physical human being character, but the book by Mary Shelley, which Vivian also has a copy of. There it is. Woo! I think we did promise that we were going to be talking about Frankenstein, but not in the way that anyone's going to think. This isn't necessarily a deep dive into queer representation. Oh,
I think we've done that enough this season, to be fair.
Exactly. I actually wanted to use Frankenstein because there is this claim that is somewhat substantiated, but it really depends on who you talk to, that Frankenstein is the first science fiction novel or first science fiction story. While I kind of love being able to use that as a way to make annoying boys on the internet shut up, it's not actually true by a long way. However, I will give it the large thing of being called what I would call the first hard science fiction story, that it is science as we would recognise in a modern world being used to tell a story about how that affects people and its effect on other things. Whereas I don't necessarily think that it is the first actual science fiction story, and there are quite a few people who would agree with me. But have you heard about this, that it's the first sci-fi story?
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously, like, it was debated and stuff when we studied it at uni, and because I did study it at uni. And that was something that was discussed as, like, is it not, where does it fit, all that kind of stuff. But it popped up again when, I think it was the New York Times books posted up a thing a couple of years ago now about H.G. Wells being the founder of science fiction.
Oh, yeah.
And everyone complained.
Yeah.
And the biggest fight was Mary Shelley.
Yeah. H.G. Wells, honestly, no. Not by a long chalk. And again, it really depends on how you're defining science fiction, because if you're defining it by what we term science in our current modern age, then that's one thing. If you're defining science as being the study of scientific process, as in natural philosophy or alchemy or even what we might have called magic in the past, because all of those things become science, that is a very different thing, and that is something that has a huge amount of work behind it. So I want to do I'm going to go back. I've decided I'm going to start at Frankenstein and go back rather than forward to Frankenstein, because I think that is quite an interesting way to do it. We all kind of know the story of Frankenstein. Man creates monster, man abandons monster, monster is sad, meaning of humanity, discussion of what that is. Everybody has a bad time.
Is man monster?
Oh, wow.
That's your Frankenstein 101 for anyone currently studying it.
Are men jealous of women's ability to create life? The answer is yes. Anyway, that's Frankenstein, right? And it's developed in a period of time. This book comes out, we all know the story. If you don't, Mary Shelley is on holiday with her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and his friend Lord Byron, and the rest of a kind of group of friends. And they're trapped in a villa on the banks of Lake Geneva, I think it is. And there's a massive storm, and they all decide to tell ghost stories and write these stories for each other. And during that period of time, she has this dream that eventually develops into being Frankenstein. Mary Shelley herself is the daughter of one of the founders of the feminist movement, I suppose we could call her, Mary Wollstonecraft, as well as her father being an academic and a professor in his own right, So she is an incredibly well-versed an educated young woman for the time, and has a huge amount of ideas about what's going on in the world, and she's also intensely depressed as a human. And this book comes out of all of that, and what is happening in the world, how science is changing, how the world is changing, and what that looks like. We've kind of just sort of really seen the inventions and ideas around electricity, how we can harness it, kite, key, kind of thing. That didn't actually happen, but that kind of idea. And so she's living in this world of extreme change. However, she is not the first person to live in a world of extreme change. She will not be the last, as we well know. And she is also not the first person to think about what the world might look like in these ideas of changing and fantastical ways that science can be used, and what it looks like to people. And I also think it's worth pointing out that she is also influenced by other stories she's read and things. This does not come out of, we've talked about this before, the idea of the creative as a single entity. This is not true. I don't want to diminish, that's not diminishing her work. It's an incredible work of fiction, and it's an incredible piece of
it's
discussion.
Just creativity is just a response to your context and your community.
Exactly.
And
exactly. So anyway, the reason I wanted to start with that is because I think it's really worth going back and looking at the other things that kind of lead to that point. I kind of love this idea that book, while it is what I would definitely call hard science fiction, it kind of falls into the same category as your things more similar to Star Trek and stuff like that, where there's a real consideration for how science works. To me, feels like something where she may not have read other science fiction books, I don't know, but there are little hints of other things. And so one of the first ones I kind of want to talk about is, I think it is called The Dream by Johannes Kepler. And Johannes Kepler is a philosopher, scientist, alchemist almost, I guess. He's an astronomer. That's what he's most known for. And when he is studying, he writes down a dream that he has about a demon coming and giving him and his mother, particularly, and that is useful to this piece of information, ideas and understanding. And it's a story about what that looks like. And he is talking about how is influenced by these ideas and how they helped him as a person. And this story, he then worries later on, is actually used as part of his mother being tried for witchcraft, which he then has to defend her over a process of, I think, 4 years. He defends her at trial, and she is eventually freed. Of course, this is a horribly traumatic event for everybody involved. But she is found innocent because of him using logic and scientific method to basically prove she's not a witch. What? But he has written this story, and it is a fascinating story. And it has all the hallmarks of a science fiction story. You live in your real, normal little world, and then something changes, and you suddenly see the world differently, and you understand it differently, and you're given an understanding beyond that. It feels almost like an alien abduction story or something like that. Though the alien doesn't abduct, it just comes and interacts and leaves again. That's not a brilliant description of the book, but it's worth going and having a look at. But he writes this in 1608. It is published in 1633. I think that's a good 200 years before we get Frankenstein. So if scientists, he is a scientist of the time, it's not what we would necessarily call a scientist now, but he is an astronomer, he is studying the stars, he is using scientific, logical method to work things out and to prove that somebody is not a witch. And his work is the basis for a lot of astronomy that we still do. That, to me, says science fiction. just because it's not necessary. We might call it magic. We might call this science fantasy in the kind of ilk of Star Wars, right? But if that is your understanding of science and how it works, and you live in a world where demons and magic and gods and all this sort of stuff are real as far as you're concerned, because they were, you know, God is real, the devil is real, demons are real, fairies are real, and you're studying them in some way, to me that reads as science fiction. But I'm also not necessarily, I don't know. I think it is something that we can definitely argue. I think it is arguably a science fiction novel, story, book, thing.
A couple of years ago, when this New York Times book thing tweeted about H.G. Wells, I actually wrote, and I'll link it in the description. I was trying to reread it while you were talking, Ben. It's too long. But I wrote a very lengthy blog post that was all about science fiction, magic, and mythology, and the intersections of them and definitions. So from an anthropological point of view, and someone who has studied religion. So if that's something of people's interest. But one of the things that is really fascinating about the history of the anthropology of religion, and particularly when you talk about the way that white people have studied religion historically, there was a period of time where certain beliefs, particularly involving magic, and I'm going to use quotes around that because not everybody that was described as having magical beliefs would themselves describe it as magic. So any of the ones that were prescribed that way were kind of seen as irrational, and obviously they're a bit silly because magic doesn't exist, all of this kind of stuff. So there's this anthropologist by the name of E. Evans Pritchard who comes along and writes what is still one of the most fundamental pieces of anthropology of religion that exists, even though it's quite old at this point and has some issues. But it was so fundamental because it basically was a guy going, hey, these people are rational. Boom!
Yeah. Well, and it's quite interesting because there are two other pieces similar to this I want to talk about happening in the 1600s, right? And the 1600s, if you know the history of the 1600s, particularly in Europe and the West, in inverted commas, but we'll say Europe, is a period not dissimilar to the period that Mary Shelley is writing Frankenstein in, right? It's a period of mass and upheaval of knowledge and understanding. We're going through a scientific renaissance and enlightenment. All of this kind of stuff is happening. People are studying science and the stars and alchemy and understanding it in a way that is away from myth as something separate, but combining the two things together. Because that's their understanding. Like you said, they're rational. They still have this understanding that God put the heavens and all this kind of stuff, but they're looking at that through scientific process. And that's happening in the 1600s massively. It's the reason you get witch trials in the 1600s, because people are terrified of this huge wave of change and changing how they understand and look at the world. And so they're grasping onto old ways, things that make sense to them. Because you also have in this period The Blazing World by Margaret Cavendish, who, please look up Margaret Cavendish. The woman is an absolute eccentric and genuinely wonderful. She turns up to court, so she's posh, but she turns up to court in a dress that is so low cut you can see her nipples, wearing nipple pasties in the 1600s. Queen behaviour, right? She was also definitely a lesbian. Well, queer in some capacity. And The Blazing Worlds is satirical, but it's also a utopian fiction about her, self-insert her, being invited to or taken to a wonderful world alien to her own, and the experiences she has there. She meets the Empress. They have a fun time together by all accounts. And it's a science fiction story. And she talks about this journey that she has and what it is, and how, you can have, this, it is a science fiction story. You look at it and go, oh, okay, yeah, I see that. Yeah, so she is taken to a kingdom where essentially it's at the North Pole, and there's this thing where she thinks she's going to die of hypothermia, but actually she goes into a cave, and it's this amazing world of things under the ice and all this kind of stuff. And a fantastical adventure in the same way that, 2000 Leagues is, or any of these kind of ones that we know about. I would say it fits into that same mould of the weird fiction books of the early 20th century, these fantastical adventures. And it's written in 1666, Like, this is a full-on science fiction journey story in 1666. And then I think there is another one in this period. In then 1616, so that's the earliest of these, you have The Chemical Wedding, which is written by Jonah Valentine Andre, and it's meant to be written by a character called Kristen Rosenkrantz. I think I pronounced that right. And again, it's about being invited to a fantastical event, a royal wedding that happens within an adventure in another world, and it's about exploring that world and understanding it through the eyes of a layman who doesn't necessarily get it. But it is, again, it's very much a story of using science as it is understood in the 1600s, in the early 1600s, and talking about that and addressing what that might mean to people and how that looks to people who have never seen it before. It's a really interesting thing to see. You've got Kepler and Andre writing at the same time. Andre is published first and then Kepler later. And then you have Margaret Cavendish 40 years later write another book, which I would absolutely say she would have been influenced by these two. She was an incredibly educated woman, an incredibly passionate woman with a lot of things to say. I would be really, really interested. I would love to have a conversation with Margaret Cavendish, not gonna lie. She's brilliant. And I wouldn't be surprised if someone like Mary Wollstonecraft, where Margaret Cavendish is pushing for education, she's looking at like what, she is a woman who is pushing the boundaries of what being a woman in the 1600s means. And I would not be surprised if someone like Mary Wollstonecraft, then in the 17 and 1800s, would be looking back to someone like her and her writings and her understanding of the world. And so you can kind of see these through threads of these stories and these understandings. I haven't been able to find in my research anything that kind of then fits into what I would call science fiction earlier than that in post. Right, this is it. Year zero. Nothing really till that, but we do have, you've got Lucian, right? So Lucian is an ancient Greek writer, and he also writes a satirical utopian sci-fi story because he's making fun of people who would go places and come back and say, oh my god, I saw these amazing things, look at all these amazing creatures I've seen. And he went, oh no, fuck you dead, that's not real, you're lying. And so he wrote a story called A True Story, and it is essentially an adventure. Again, these are adventure stories, right? Where he and some friends are going on a journey, on holiday essentially, and they get swept up and taken to the moon, which he comprehends as a place, right? So this is ancient Greek where you have a goddess of the moon, but he sees the moon as a place. There is a discussion of the moon as an entity within this book. And obviously that is what great ancient Greek philosophers are talking about as well. But he is going, we're going to the moon as a place, where they get there and then there's an all-out war happening between an evil empire and the good guys, the Rebel Alliance. No, they're not called that, but they are called the Rebellion. And this evil empire happening on the moon, and he gets involved in it. And there's discussions in it about gender and sexuality, like that men in the moon colony place, they're all kind of meant to look a bit like plants, I think, from my reading of it. They bear children and the women don't, and there's an empress and all this kind of stuff, and they get involved in this war and helping to solve it. There are straight up things that could be described as laser cannons involved in this war, and spaceships and all this sort of stuff. This is in the 2nd century AD, by the way, just for anybody who's interested, that this is happening. The war gets won, they have a lovely time. They leave, they have a stopover at Cloud Cuckoo Land, which is a reference to, I want to say, Aristophanes, and a play of his, and then they come home and they tell everyone this very true story about what happened. That's a science fiction story. You have gone to a place other than your own and been involved in an intergalactic war. It's on the moon, and then you come home, right? I can't see that as anything else. But yeah, I'm sure there are academics studying this.
Yeah, I was about
properly.
to say, I think, because there are myths from India.
Yeah.
In which there are flying machines that sound incredibly similar to helicopters. And things like that. So there's a lot of things in, particularly those mythologies are the ones that I can immediately think of that, if you read now, would seem like those speculative science fictions where you're like, ooh, they got it right. It's what it reads like. And these are Very, very old myths.
Yeah. And what I think, again, it's very telling that these things are happening as a way of explaining stuff. It's what we do with science fiction is to use science as a way to tell a story and to explain it and to explore. And that's what these stories are doing. They're not just a magical fantasy adventure, which at some point, where do you draw the line between science fiction and fantasy? That's a whole argument about speculative fiction. But like in these stories, they are using what their knowledge and their understanding of the natural world, of philosophy, of people going traveling and all this kind of stuff to talk about things and speculate about things and their understanding of them through scientific ideas and method of their particular time that they live in. These are rational humans, as we've described. They're not going, oh my goodness, fairies and elves exist and I'm going to tell a story about fairies and elves. They're going, no, this is my understanding of the world that I live in.
Although
where clearly there are fairies and elves.
Sorry, I do need to point out that fairies and elves is still a rational thought.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean, exactly. They're going, fairies and elves is a rational thought, that's the world I live in, so I'm going to tell that story. And I think we as modern humans, in our little time with all the scientific knowledge that we have, are very, very quick to be like, that doesn't count because it's not got my understanding of science in it. They are doing science. It's just different. It's just science that we had to do before we got to this bit of science that we're doing now. And therefore, it's science fiction. You know? And also because so many things, particularly in the 2nd century AD, we would now say like, oh no, what you were doing was engineering, what you were doing was exploration, what you were doing was physics, etc., etc., etc. They don't separate them in the same way. They're all one thing because they're just doing the finding out bit and they're learning and they're understanding. And they do have separation. You obviously have philosophy and all this sort of stuff, but they separate it differently. And so we cannot disregard that as, well, that doesn't count. Yeah, that's the little history bit. Now we get to the discussion bit. That's exciting.
Yeah, I think because in my little blog post thing was a lot about particularly magic and religion and mythology all functioning, but basically how often we think of science as having to be like, again, you said Star Trek. I think Star Trek is such a good like base colloquial idea of what science fiction is. Mm-hmm. It's got space shit. Not all science fiction has to have space shit, but it helps.
Yeah. Space is a good place to start. It's why, again, I'm like, I kind of would, particularly a true story of Lucian, I'm like, it's got space shit. They went to space.
But at the same time, you could argue that Star Wars, which is space shit, is more of a fantasy than a sci-fi.
That's true.
And primarily it's because of how they talk about the stuff. Like, the amount that I have glazed over watching Star Trek Next Generation because they are explaining a science thing that doesn't exist. I don't care how your nuclear explosive thing that doesn't fucking exist works, because it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I think Doctor Who do a better job of it, of kind of going, it works, quick.
But that's like, the thing, right, is in like our daily lives, using technology and using things that science has produced, that's the attitude we have. Is I don't know. It's just like we have a built gaming PC in the living room that I use to edit my videos and stuff on and play Stardew Valley. And but we've been having issues with the Wi-Fi, that like connector bit in it. And so we've been running experiments to try to figure out what's going wrong. And we figured out what was wrong. I don't know why that was what was going wrong. It like the placement, if you move the computer just like 2 centimeters over, suddenly works. Don't know.
Yeah.
Don't know. But it works.
Yeah.
So that's what we're doing. Like how many people could you sit down and be like, explain how the internet works?
Yeah, well, exactly. I don't
right?
know. Yeah.
But then you have these fantasy stories that are particularly ones with a hard magic system, are deep. Again, I don't care. You don't need to explain it to me. It doesn't exist. It's the same mentality to me of it's deep explanations of systematic approaches that people have in that world, have studied and understand and can explain to you, and they make something run. Isn't just a hard science system or a hard magic system a sci-fi story?
Yeah. Well, as somebody who's currently writing a long fantasy novel, One of the things I decided very early on was that I was not going to explain how magic worked, because not one of the characters who has a point of view in the story would understand how it works. They just know it does, right? They're just going to go, it does. I don't know. It just does. Like, because I don't know how electricity really works. I get the concept, and I know that it does things, but I couldn't tell you the base, every piece of information about electricity and how it does things. That makes me sound really stupid. But, like, I couldn't, if someone pinned me down to be like, how does it work? I'd be like, well, I think it does. But also, we as a race do not understand magnetism. We have magnets. We know magnets do a thing. Why do they do the thing? Nobody knows. They just do. Right? Again, I'm sure there's some scientists who are figuring it out. But as far as I can tell, no one really understands magnets. And I have looked. I've looked.
Was that thing of the Insane Clown Posse had that song where they were like, what are even magnets?
Yeah, I know, exactly. But like we've just said, we don't really understand Wi-Fi. It's in our houses. We use it every day. We're using it right now to do this
and
recording.
Apparently it doesn't like trying to read things through the metal leg of a desk.
See? Like, this is it. So why is it that, like, every character in a fantasy novel should have a deep, consistent understanding of magic, right? That wizard who's sitting up atop of a tower, who's dedicated his entire life to studying one portion of magic, would be able to tell you, in much the same way if you have a conversation with any scientist, they will be able to tell you in depth about their study of their bit of science, right? They will not be able to tell you anything about another part of science that is in no way related to theirs. You ask a marine biologist to explain their particular part of marine biology, they'll go on for days and days and days. You ask them to explain nuclear physics, the likelihood is they cannot explain nuclear physics to you in any level of depth. And I think fantasy novels should do that. I think fantasy novels should have that level of, like, degrees of separation about how magic is studied, because I think that's funny.
But yeah, I mean, just kind of on its basis, the idea of something being science versus magic, just historically speaking, is often rooted in colonialism. Mm-hmm. And of putting down particular cultural understandings. Like, as much as, like, when you were saying about, the beliefs in elves and stuff make sense in this particular time period. Well, there are people that believe that now. And those are also just as rational because, again, it's a completely different cultural structure. It's a completely different societal structure. It's a completely different understanding of the world. There are places in the world where it is completely rational to believe that rocks move. Not all rocks. Special rocks.
Special rocks. Okay.
Because they are special rocks.
And they move.
And they have agency because they are people. And this is... Yes, so there's this is a whole separate discussion. It was one of my favorite discussions to have with students was what the difference is between a person and a human.
Oh, yeah. I think this is a discussion we should have with the furry community. No.
So it was always really fun. I was infamous with particularly first years for being the student teacher person that would come in and be like, lead with the most crazy question that would just jumpstart discussions. Because that was always my favorite things, to come in and be like, cool, everyone doing well, all right, what's the difference?
Well, this is the conversation, this is what iRobots are at, isn't it? And Android's Stream of Electric Sheep. That's what these stories
pretty much, yeah. It's
like
the entire idea of personhood is, particularly in science fiction, I mean, it's a discussion in Frankenstein of the fact that the monster that Frankenstein created is more of a person than Frankenstein in some ways. Yeah. So that becomes a discussion point of when is personhood, and so yeah, in different cultures, personhood is designated differently. So there's big moves in New Zealand within the last couple of years to designate personhood to certain areas of land, because the Maori have seen these areas of land as persons, and therefore to protect them, they give them personhood, legally speaking, so that way you can actually legally protect the landscape.
That's amazing. That's such an interesting way of looking at it.
Yes.
I think that's really fascinating. Particularly because if we're going to talk about these stories that are being written in the 16th century, you have the whole discussion about the soul, right? And what does and doesn't have a soul, and that being personhood, right? That if something has a soul, it's a person, and if it doesn't, then it doesn't count. And I think that's a really, really interesting discussion. And it is essentially, the soul is another use for the term of personhood, isn't it? Like, is it
some cultures?
Yeah, well, exactly. But like, again, it's complicated. But it's a very
some cultures
interesting.
Don't believe in a soul at all.
Well, fair enough. But I think it's a very interesting way of discussing it, to be like, what makes a person, and what language are we going to use to describe that? And science fiction, however it is, whenever it's written, wherever it's written, I think a large part of it comes down to that kind of discussion. It also comes down to, I want to go to space and look at things, but I want to go on a magical adventure.
But what is happening essentially is that somebody who is most of the time, they are white men that look at something and determine, oh, well, that's magical fantasy. Oh, that's rational and within my realm of thinking, therefore it is science.
Yeah.
And that is where the designation falls, rather than with what is actually inherently going on.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's a big issue.
If you look at something, say, like Gulliver's Travels, which is a science fiction story, but there are definitely people who'd be like, oh no, that's a magical fantasy story, because he's going on a magical fantasy adventure and meeting like little, people, like borrowers or whatever they are, that kind of thing. And I'm like, well, no, it falls into the same hallmark as Star Trek. Star Trek is Gulliver's Travels, essentially, isn't it? You go places, you learn about people, you go to the next place, you learn about people. That's very reductive. But like, if literally it's, oh no, it has to have my understanding of science in it, and my understanding is a white, Western, male view of science, then I think you narrow your vision to anybody else's point of view, obviously, but also you lose a huge chunk of like what you could be learning about and how you could perceive the world, which is what the point of science fiction is, to help you open your vision and to understand other things. That was what Mary Shelley was trying to do. I don't know whether she would put it in those words, but if you then read her later writings, that's what she's trying to do again. She's trying to understand the world. One thing I wanted to ask you about particularly was, because obviously, as I said, I looked at this from a very European point of view, because I felt it was something that I know quite a lot about European history. It's something that I've studied a lot of. It's something that has influenced my sphere a lot of. I come from a background of, my father was a scientist, my sister's a scientist, my mum's a physicist, all this sort of stuff. So I come from a background of very specific understanding of science. Well, obviously, being white British human beings. And so I wanted to talk to you about the rest of the world, because I think it's absolutely worth talking about. I don't think we should put it like that either. We should talk about things that are not within this sphere of understanding.
I should stress, I am an expert in contemporary popular culture. I have obviously studied briefly other places in the world, but not to the same extent. As we have just said, scientists will be able to tell you in a large amount of their specialism.
Yes. Well, exactly. I feel like I put you on the spot with that. But I wanted to
I can only do my best.
An understanding. Yeah, exactly. Because, I think it is a very good thing that we acknowledge that we don't know as much about that as we maybe ought to, or we could go away and learn things, and also that it is important for us to recognise that there is not just one point of view. We've talked about that. There isn't just one point of view, and it isn't just people who were making science fiction stories in Europe in the 1600s. There is so much more than that. You look at how Native American culture has created their myths and all that kind of stuff, and they have some incredible understandings about the world through their own points of view, and they're just so different to ours. And it's different depending on where you are in the Americas as well. Like, they're not one people. It's not just all one blob. That would be the same as saying everyone in Europe was one blob, which is obviously nuts. So yeah, I would be very interested to have a little conversation about what you do know, and maybe we can talk about where we should go and look for more things, and what would be not worth looking for, but where it would be good to look.
Well, like, as I said, I think if you're interested in kind of weird, speculative mythology that involves interesting technology, old Hindu myths, particularly from India, are really interesting places to go. In fact, they've been used by Hindu nationalists in more contemporary times to demonstrate that actually it wasn't, say, somebody in Europe that invented X item. It was actually the ancient Indians, and the technology was just lost because of their cycle of time and how that works. So, which is a very interesting perspective, and I'm not saying that they're right or wrong. I just think it's really fascinating. But I only know very little about it. So that's something to go and read about if that is something that is of interest to you. The other thing that is kind of worth mentioning is to have Vivian talk about mythology for a little bit. Only very briefly, which is just to say that thinking of mythology as purely explanation is not a good way to think about mythology. It's an understanding that it came about in about the 1700s?
Okay.
Roughly around that time. And again, it was a very white cultural standpoint to think of myths, typically not white Western myths, but or Christian myths. It was always particularly black, but really from anywhere that wasn't England. That was kind of the thought process. But anything else was an explanation because, again, they're irrational, they don't have knowledge, they don't have science, so this is what their science is. And in fact, E.B. Tyler was one of the people who thought this, and he also had a thought that religion in its entirety would die out very soon because we now have science, so we don't need religion and myths. And
yeah, okay.
And I think we can look around us and see that didn't happen. So clearly there's something else going on.
And also people who maybe have lost religion have replaced it with other beliefs that aren't necessarily quote unquote rational in inverted commas. Like, I mean, conspiracy theories, I think, come into this a little bit. Things like, if you're trying to explain, you know, COVID and stuff like that from a non-science, like people have been grasping at these things recently. We talk about things like flat Earth and all that kind of stuff. And obviously the Earth is not flat, but I don't necessarily think that the reason for people thinking the Earth is not flat is because they're, you know, not thinking logically or whatever. I think it's because they're looking for something else and they've grasped onto maybe something that isn't the right thing. And I do think we should have some more patience with people. I mean, not when they get to crazy levels, because that's just, it's always going to be racist and anti-Semitic at the end of the day. But I think there is a level to conspiracy theories that is people trying to grasp at a belief system and a community system, which maybe in the past religion would. I don't want to. No,
I think if this is a whole other discussion that maybe we could have on a friend of mine for, because for people who want to go down that rabbit hole, a safe way to do so is through a friend of mine named David Robertson, who specializes in religion and conspiracy theories.
Oh, okay, cool.
So
I'm not grasping at straws. Good.
Great place to go
Yeah.
for more of that. And again, my knowledge of that extends to all of the talks I have heard him give.
But this is it. I think we've talked about this, and we talked about how people dismiss these ideas as irrational and all that kind of stuff. But it's not. It's people in a time and a place and a space where they are looking for ways to talk about, not just explain things, talk about things, but also just to exist.
I was about to say, it's a misunderstanding of intention, right?
Yeah.
So if, and this, for going way back for people listening, and not so way back for us talking, the new Taylor Swift, we were talking about Taylor Swift, and the fans kind of reading things very differently. And a lot of it is people not quite understanding metaphor, right? So she writes this song that is incredibly metaphorical, and people are reading it literally. And so you're misunderstanding intention, and that doesn't necessarily mean that your reading is wrong, but it does mean that people who are reading a completely different thing is reading a different intention. And so sometimes, particularly when you're talking about older stories, people would be looking back and saying, oh, well, this must have been their intention, but we either don't know their intention or people weren't listening to their intention. And therefore, we're able to kind of swing it in a completely different way and say, oh, well, it must have been explanation. But just because a story ends with, and that's why there's lightning, doesn't mean that's an explanation for lightning.
Yeah.
It could be a lot of other things, but you're reading it quite literally, and that isn't always necessarily how it's supposed to be read. The idea of myth as metaphor is also very hotly debated, and a lot of indigenous populations, not all of them, but quite a lot of them, really dislike the idea of myth as metaphor, because again, it's saying, well, you don't mean that elves exist, it must be a metaphor. Yeah. And again, people do.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's minimizing the actual belief structures that are present. So there's a lot of that going on. And I think that even when you're looking at literature rather than mythology, so published works that we can point at, which is going to be my way of designation, because I would say that Frankenstein is a myth, but that's a different discussion for a different time. But for the kind of written literature, the Mary Shelleys and stuff like that, we sometimes know intention and we sometimes don't.
Yeah.
And again, this is where I think really where genre comes into play. When we talk about different genres in literature, in TV shows, in movies, a lot of it is intention.
Yeah.
What are you intending to do with this? And then also, how is it then being communicated? And that's, I think, often where we get the cross genres is where you get kind of intention mixing with result.
Yeah. I mean, that's what, like, we mentioned Star Wars, which is science fantasy. It's very clearly a fantasy story. There's wizards in space, but it's in space. So you could literally transpose the entirety of Star Wars into a mythological sphere or a fantastical sphere, and it would be the same story. It would read exactly the same. It's just it wouldn't be wouldn't be in space anymore. Obi-Wan would still be Obi-Wan. Luke would still have a magical sword. He would still be the hero and defeating the evil empire. That can go into any landscape. It just happens to be in space, which I think makes it science fiction or science fantasy, really. And that's and I think that's literally that we're not very good at being able to go, but the setting is space, so it must be science.
Yeah. And of course, intention, people can have more than one intention. We're able to hold multiple ideas and thoughts and intentions in our minds at once as human beings. We are very capable of multi-thought. Yeah. Which sounds like a very sci-fi thing.
Multi-thought.
It's like double speak, multi-thought.
Yeah. I think particularly as well, like, the other thing that's worth remembering with intention is that a lot of what we have as particularly indigenous cultures myth is through the lens of the colonizers who went there and fucked everything up.
Yes.
Particularly if you look at Central or South America with Aztec, Inca populations, all that kind of stuff. We only have, for the most part, the writings of the Spanish conquistadors who went there and fucked everything up and wrote it through their lens of Catholic people in a certain period of a certain time, thinking that they were coming and they were going to, this was a land that needed to be Christianized or whatever. And I think that is a very, very important thing that we need to remember when we look back at or look to these stories, that even if people are studying them and people are doing a lot of study of them and making them, trying to work out what they meant, there's only fragments, and it's having to work that back up, and there are so many levels of bias and interpretation and all this sort of stuff on this that it's very difficult to look at these stories.
We used to have this discussion a lot with students, because I used to teach on a myth course, and one of the big final projects, it would be something that they would be slowly working on throughout the whole year, is that they were supposed to do a really deep analysis of a mythology with like 2 or 3 myths. And so very early on, they would kind of pick their area, and then they would have small little things to like build to the larger paper at the end. And one of the things that they had to do was write about the context. So this is the context that this story took place in. And it was always really difficult to have to stress to them, it's not what you think it is, that context. Because we had a lot of Norse. So we had a lot of Prosetica, Poetica, and there was a lot of people trying to say it was this pre-Christian area, and it's like, well, no, it was written by a Christian missionary. Yeah. That's the context. Yeah. So if you are using the prosetta, then that's the context that you are having to describe this from, because that's what you have.
Yeah. There's a whole discussion about the representation of Loki through and things like that, because Loki is basically turned into a devil type of character because of Christian missionaries, and that is so unhelpful to the actual... Yeah, that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah. So unless you have access to an actual... Because there are still indigenous people, they still exist, and they are still telling stories. If you can access, which I think a lot of them are also starting to share things as much as they can online, but not everything, because some things are closed practices. But if you can find those, that's probably going to actually be your closest. And no, it might not be written, but that actually can make it more... I was going to say real. That's the wrong word.
Present.
More authentic.
Yeah.
To what the actual original is going to be, because it's going to have been carried through the actual cultural lens.
And I think particularly with a lot of... We've talked about the Native American cultures, and I mean, and the Americas in as a whole, multiple continents, is very, very different across, which part you're in and all that kind of stuff. But there are, particularly in North America, a lot of those practices are incredibly closed for...
Particularly to white people, because obviously.
Yeah. But what is shared out of them is a completely different type of storytelling, and also a completely different understanding of the world and how our place in it and stuff like that. So if you can talk to people or find blogs written by Indigenous peoples, it's absolutely worth doing, because you get some really... It's very difficult to change how you think about the world, but it's worth trying, So
I mean, it's always just one of those things where when I was teaching and where I taught was primarily middle to upper class, white, educated Southern Brits. Or English people, I should specify, because it's not like we had a lot of Scottish people roaming around there. And so a lot of them also came from very Christian backgrounds.
Yeah.
And so having to point out that when you kind of strip it, Christianity looks real irrational. And that was the Evans Pritchard kind of point, was he was talking about how in the village that he went to study with the Azandi. He was studying with the Azandi, and they would have stuff like whenever something was misfortunate that happened, they would kind of say, oh, that's witchcraft. What they meant was kind of like the way that people say, oh, it must be God's will.
Right.
Right?
See, yes.
This is the way that the universe has constructed the way things are. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it is done with ill intent from an individual person actively, and sometimes it's just what happens. And that's kind of also the way that Christianity would phrase things. Yeah. It's the way that everyone phrases things. Guess that's the way things were meant to be, right? It's the same idea, but when you're coming at it from a different context, again, you're reading different intention into it if you don't actually pay attention to what the people are actually doing and saying. Because
if you say, oh, it's witchcraft in certain areas, particularly Christian areas, they will genuinely be like, there's a witch.
Yeah.
Somebody's doing that, someone's actively
Which sometimes
doing that.
There was, I should stress. But sometimes it was just, that's life.
I suppose in the same way that when people say, oh, it's God acting through me, or whatever, that kind of thing of like, the intent is not necessarily my own or whatever, but also... It is a person doing something. It's quite interesting when you start looking at that. I find it really interesting as somebody who was brought up in a scientific household, but with a level of religion involved in that. What that looks like when you become an adult and you're kind of starting to go, I need to dissect what's what here and all that kind of thing. It's really interesting. That's not what this episode's meant to be about.
No. But I was going to
partially
say,
what's these stories are about.
Speaking of the kind of history of looking back and stuff, I haven't personally done much research into it, so I can't give names or specifics or anything like that, but I do know that Islam has a very long history of science. They are some of the first scientists for a particular area of the world. The very first anthropologist who existed was a Muslim scholar. So it's not something that is talked a lot about in classes that I took. I had to find this out on my own. This is something, so I don't know much literature from that area of the world, but I would not be surprised if there was a very early sci-fi story from a Muslim writer.
I would be surprised either.
it would totally track.
Yeah.
Because a lot of religions in the world don't have a problem with science. It's primarily a particular form of Christianity that does. Most of the rest of the world doesn't. I say most because there's going to be ones that don't. But Islam has historically had a very good relationship with science. And so that's why a lot of scientific thought really flourished under a Muslim empire. So, again, I haven't done those readings, so I cannot list anything, but I am sure that one exists.
Yeah. I would agree with that, and it is one of those things that I could have done a research rabbit hole for weeks and weeks and weeks, if not months and months and months on this, and I decided I didn't want to do that for a hour-long podcast episode. But I think it is something that I would like to find out about. If any of our listeners have any idea where to start doing that, if not, I'm gonna go and have a look, because I think that's a nice little takeaway to be like, what should I go and learn about? What should we go and learn about collectively? Yeah. And that is different things. The world. But yeah, I think this has been a good discussion about science fiction. I do think there is one thing that a lot of people, and we've talked about this before, is the idea that religion and science cannot coexist, because they absolutely do and absolutely should. They can. It's fine. And this idea that if you are a scientist, or you should not believe in God, which many of the scientists who we talk about, like people like Darwin, for example, who struggled massively with those two things coexisting together, and how he could put his research and his discoveries alongside a Christian belief and all that kind of stuff. Kepler, who we've talked about, clearly was looking at this through that context. They were one and the same. They were part and parcel of like the world, and working out how, being your understanding of the world. So I think it's not irrational to do both. Yeah. And it's foolish to say otherwise.
Yeah,
and as we said about Islam, Islam is a very scientific. We talk about the Arab empires and the Muslim empires of, I guess the early medieval ages and the what we would call the early modern age and all that kind of stuff.
I was about to say the Ottomans were just long, amount of time.
But and how we have an incredible understanding of a lot of what we now call science from those areas, what we call medicine, from all these kinds of things come from that part of the world, and those people, the people doing work there. And it is shocking that I don't know more about it, and I should.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite pieces of pop culture that kind of talks about the science religion thing is actually Full Metal Alchemist, where you've got this obviously very supposed to be Western main characters who that's basically what they're struggling with the whole time, is this kind of question of where everything fits and how it divides. And then they run into the character who's supposed to be from the East, and that person's like, what are you talking about divide? Yeah. What are you talking about separate categories? We're just talking about the world, and the world is made up of all of these things. And so you get this completely different perspective of what is supposed to be the East onto the West, of being like, whoa, what are you doing? And it's one of my favorite things.
I think that's a good place to end this. I think we've discussed science fiction. I will fully allow people to continue to say that Mary Shelley had one of the first true sci-fi novels. I think it's reasonable. It's definitely one of the first hard sci-fi novels, in inverted commas, and also annoys certain people on the internet, and that's fun. So don't let facts get in the way of your fun. No, don't. Don't do that. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for this discussion, Vivian. It's been great. It always is. I've been Holly Swinyard, and you'll get the thing at the beginning of the show, but my book is out now. It's out in bookshops. You can get it. So please go and get a copy of A History of Fans and Fandom, The Passion and Power of Fan Culture. Give us a review, a like, etc. That would be awesome.
I have been Vivian Asimos, and you can pre-order my book. It's not out yet. But you can pre-order my book from reaction.com. I think it's just, from Reaction Books. Reaction with a K. And yeah, I don't know. Follow me on socials or whatever for any other updates.
Thank you so much for listening. Follow the social media, subscribe to the podcast, and we will see you next time. Bye! Thanks for listening. Remember to like, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast, and do give it a share. Tell your friends, family, and fellow fans and get the word out. You can follow us on social media, links in the show notes, as are some links to further reading. Who doesn't like a reading list? We are nerds after all. Music for this episode was Nowhere Land by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons Attribute 3.0. This episode was produced by Vivian, Asimos, and Holly Swinyard. It's really annoying, but we're still recording, so you can just cut all of this out. Yeah, just cut all of this out. Ba-doobie-doobie-doobie.